Well, let's help people not get to that end of the spectrum by giving them early signs and symptoms. Obviously, weight gain. You mentioned hypoglycemia. That would be a little bit more subtle, hard to detect. But what are the things early on people can look for and realize they're heading down this path we've been talking about?
Well, luckily, it's what you said. It's looking in the mirror, right? You can pretty quickly tell when most individuals are fully aware that they're gaining weight because they see themselves every day. They put on clothes that may not fit the way it used to. You look in the mirror, you don't look the way you used to. You're putting on excess body fat. A lot of people have scales in their home. They're seeing the scale rise. Those are the clear, easy signs. Okay, everything we're talking about after this is usually because that was let to persist for too long, and or not just persist, but actually get worse. And so that's one of the early signs. But there are a number of biomarkers someone could assess early on to say, okay, even maybe I don't have excess adipose tissue, but am I metabolically healthy? And one of the big ones we talked about is insulin, right? You can get a fasted insulin level to see if your insulin level is rising, okay? Because one of the early signs prior to elevations in glucose is elevating insulin levels. So a fasted insulin is probably not a bad idea. Although you want to make sure when you get that assessed that you control, what you're eating the night before because it can affect it. But just assuming you keep all these things controlled and you go get fasted blood work, your insulin levels are elevated, that would start to indicate to you, okay, yeah, I have fasted. I'm gaining weight. My insulin higher. Okay, I'm starting to develop some degree of insulin resistance. Okay, if this continues, I'm in trouble. Because then what would happen? Well, when insulin starts to rise, we also see an elevation in things like triglycerides. Triglyceride elevation is not causal in things like heart disease, but it is a sign of underlying metabolic damage. And so you can test triglycerides. If they're elevated, that would be very concerning, particularly when looking at things like it's one of the many biomarkers related to metabolic syndrome. Then you can also look at obviously fasting glucose levels or an HbA1c, which is a measure of your glucose levels over 2 to 3 months, or they have the emergence of continuous glucose monitors, which you can go test not just your fasting levels, but your response to meals and how each meal is affecting your blood glucose levels. That can be an incredibly informative process for individuals because there have been people who've reached out to me and said, hey, my doctor says I'm totally fine, but I slapped on one of these CGMs and now my blood sugar level goes to up to like 200 and 250 after meals. And by the way, I had pancreatitis 2 years ago. And I said, well, did they test you for type 3C diabetes? And did they test your C-peptide, which is a measure of how much insulin you produce? They said, oh yeah, I did. My C-peptide is actually low. I was like, well, what number is it? And I was like, that number's diagnostic for diabetes. And so a lot of times these are clues, but you have to advocate more often than not for these clues to understand what's going on. So we talked about weight. You can look in the mirror. You can see that change. You can also see it change on the scale. We talked about insulin because that's one of the first changes that occurs. And when that occurs, you start to see changes in triglycerides. Eventually, you'll see an elevation in blood glucose levels, okay? And those are really the major early signs that things are starting to change in an adverse direction. But when that starts to change, when you have an elevation in body weight, when you start to see an elevation in triglycerides, an elevation in blood glucose levels, those are actionable and changeable biomarkers. And you can do something about that when they elevate. So these aren't just biomarkers you can look at and say, oh no, that's not good. Those are biomarkers that you can assess and actually manipulate immediately. And when we talked about things like continuous glucose monitors, those are things where you can manipulate what you're doing in real time, meal to meal, and actually see the differences. And I think that while just slapping a CGM on someone, a continuous glucose monitor, by itself isn't necessarily going to induce a lifestyle change, although it has a minor effect, but it's not really meaningful. It can be incredibly empowering information for individuals to understand how they are responding to specific foods, specific lifestyle habits, and beyond. I live with a disease called type 1 diabetes where we have had continuous glucose monitors for over a decade. It's actually how people without diabetes got them. It came from our disease. It was developed for us, and then were eventually given to other people. But we also can monitor insulin every single day. And the changes in glucose, they follow insulin levels. And you can just monitor this all the time to see, okay, I exercise a day. I need about 10 to 20% less insulin all day. I go for a walk for 1 mile. And all of a sudden, I don't need nearly as much insulin today as I did the day before. I mean, these are incredible little insights into essentially gamifying your own health. But this also teaches you how things like exercise, things like various foods will affect your biomarkers. And having that type of insight can be incredibly empowering if you use it to be empowered. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of junk information that's overwhelming and you do nothing with. But if you have the right intentions with it and you really use it as an actionable tool, they're very powerful.
Do you worry if somebody does get a CGM or tests HbA1c and they're in that early phase relating back to everything we've been talking about where insulin's slowly rising, that a lot of the challenges could be masked and they might give themselves that check that all is good and continue on the path they are? How do you see that concern?
If people start to see elevations in their fasting glucose levels, if they're seeing elevations in their HbA1c, if they're seeing that their average glucose level on a CGM not only is elevated beyond normal levels, but are seeing high levels of variability that exceed what you would expect, then yes, you should do something yesterday. Because we know that in many of these conditions, particularly the best examples are in diabetes, that there is something called metabolic memory. That as glucose levels elevate and rise over time, that we start to see damage to tissues that are cumulative in response to how high they are, and it's not completely reversible. So the best day to figure it out is today. The best day to act is the second you find out you should act. Okay, that's it. It's the best day isn't tomorrow. The best day is today. Always, every single time. And it isn't about revolutionizing your entire life, by the way. That's almost destined to fail. It's about just taking a single step. Maybe you've heard, oh, wow, I heard on the podcast with Jesse, I heard he said something about like exercise in the ketogenic diet. I don't exercise that much, but I might be able to reduce my carb intake. Awesome. Cool. Do that. Or maybe it's like, okay, well, I have a hard time reducing these diet factors, but I could go for a walk every morning. Awesome. Go do that. Just start, because before you know it, you're walking 1 mile, you're walking 2 miles, you're walking 3 miles. You're starting to feel different. You're feeling more motivated. You feel more empowered. You feel like, okay, maybe I don't need to have that food anymore because you know what? I just walked 3 miles and I didn't used to do that anymore. So I can do hard things, And so you start to do other hard things. And before you know it, hell, you might be on the front of a cover magazine, or maybe Jesse will interview you on his next podcast. You never know what could come, And I'm lived example of that. I was a fat kid growing up. I had obesity as a kid. I failed for over half a decade on all these various diet strategies, these exercise protocols. I mean, my father was a marathon runner. My uncle had run 20 marathons, climbed mountains, done century rides. I was around exercise my whole life, but I had a poor diet. Okay. I rode bikes every day. I played football. I did all these things. I got obesity. Okay. And I eventually found success with reliably and sustainably changing my diet. And once I did that, I realized, oh my gosh, I feel so much better. My confidence is better. I can think better. And this was even in childhood. And I carried that for the rest of my life. And it became a career. Heck, I mean, it allowed me to do something that I felt was meaningful and important. Now, I did get type 1 diabetes along the way, by the way, but that just changed it to a whole nother level. That just made me realize that my entire life was a scientific experiment that I could learn from. All these things that happen to people, it's not, who cares if it's unfair? It doesn't matter. You can use it as a tool on your journey to improve your health and use it to empower yourself. All these examples, you don't have to go any further. Go look on YouTube. I'm sure you've interviewed tons of amazing people who've been through something really powerful in their life, and it revolutionized their experience. And all of a sudden, now they're sharing their story with other people, and now they're empowering people. Well, the people listening to your podcast, they could be that person. They just don't know it yet. The only thing they need to do is take the first step. That's what they need to do. They don't need to fix everything in their life. They're not going to. Okay, you're not going to be LeBron James tomorrow. You're not going to be Lance Armstrong tomorrow. But you might in 10 years. You might in 20 years. You never know. So again, it's just about taking the first step.
I want to come back to the CGM, HbA1c, and make sure we highlight the point we were trying to make there. The fact that if you're seeing changes there, the time to act was actually yesterday. A quote from you. What I want to bring up in that realm, what is the one test somebody can do objectively to see where they're at? Is it fasting insulin? What would you say to that person who is in that phase right now where they're wondering, am I heading down this path early stage? And they want an objective test just to see where they are.
I would say periodic testing of fasting glucose and insulin, because it also gives you a HOMA-IR scale, which is a measure of insulin resistance. However, if you really wanted me to say like the gold standard, I would get an HbA1c test, and I would also get a fasting insulin test. But fasting glucose and HbA1c are just choices along the spectrum of what might be more telling and more optimal, because a fasting glucose can change due to the meal you ate the night before. Whereas an HbA1c is a measure over a 2 to 3 month period of time. So it's less influenced by subtle acute changes. So in that way, I would say a fasting insulin and an HbA1c, because everyone can look in the mirror. Everyone knows what's normal body weight and what's not normal body weight.
You often hear in our world that skin tags are a sign that somebody is headed down this path. Have you found from your experience that is true? And does it come way too late?
I don't know anything about that, if I'm being totally honest with you. I have heard about that, and they describe it's associated with insulin, but honestly, I have no idea.
Since you made it to the end of this clip, I know you're going to love the full episode. Click here to watch. I'll see you over there.
I was a fat kid growing up. I had obesity as a kid. I failed for over half a decade on all these various diet strategies, and I eventually found success with reliably and sustainably changing my diet.